If the piles of ash did contain human bone fragments, someone had attempted to conceal an unspeakable horror. Now desperate for answers, investigators ran the license plates of a truck parked near the cabin. It belonged to Lonnie Bond, Lake's neighbor.
Hello, anybody in the house?
Lonnie Bond lived with his wife and 18-month-old son in a house about 50 yards from Lake's cabin.
Anybody home?
Officers walked next door to speak with Bond.
Hello? Anybody here? Anybody home?
The smell of decayed food thickened the air. The house appeared to have been empty for some time, perhaps months. Although it seemed the occupants departed abruptly, there was no sign of foul play. Another vehicle found on Lake's property belonged to Robin Scott Stapley. Stapley had been missing for some time, and his driver's license was found in Paul Cosner's car.
Leonard Lake had used Scott Stapley's driver's license because they were both big fellas, and he had been trying to pass himself off as Scott Stapley. So we're contacting Southern California to see, where is Scott Stapley? And it turns out that he had been living at the cabin next door, and no one has seen them either.
Investigators intensified their search. Cadaver dogs, known for their acute sense of smell, were brought in to help. Authorities now suspected that 8 missing people from Northern California were linked to the cabin. If they had been murdered, as police feared, perhaps their bodies were buried on the property.
Hey, Rick, come here.
One of the dogs recovered a piece of bone. The deputies working the scene knew immediately that this was not an animal bone. With the discovery of human remains, what had been a missing persons case now became a homicide investigation. Investigators declared Leonard Lake's property a crime scene and assembled a task force to process the cabin and surrounding property.
We're going to just brief you a little bit about what's happening.
Due to the expanding scope of the case, the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office called in additional help.
The location that we're talking about,
Specialists from the San Francisco Police Department and the California Department of Justice arrived to help with the investigation.
again,
3 days after Leonard Lake's suicide, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles descended on the property. Now that this was a murder investigation, police knew that all material recovered from the site could become vital to the eventual prosecution of the case. Each section of the property was assigned to a specific team. The teams began a thorough search of the 2 acres surrounding the cabin. In a clearing about 100 yards from the cabin, officers found a trench with loose dirt. They found the trench had been filled with personal belongings and debris.
Hey, Officer Ballard, I got something.
Sergeant Larry Copeland, an investigator for the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office, joined in the search for clues.
Every button, zipper, jewelry even, everything that was taken out of there was turned over to the evidence officer, who took each one and individually photographed each and every piece of it. And we're talking hundreds.
Everything excavated from the property was potential evidence. All of the items were collected and sent to the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office. They were meticulously cataloged. Investigators hoped that somewhere in this vast collection of evidence, they would find the clue that would untangle the mysteries hidden on Lake's property.
If we felt there was any chance of it being used or something that either ourselves or the defense could use, we took it and booked it.
Investigators sorted through the survival gear and supplies Lake had stockpiled in his so-called fallout shelter. Lieutenant Ron McFall remembers that during this phase of the search, they made a surprising discovery. There was a secret door inside the bunker.
It was a false door. You really couldn't tell just by looking at it, but there was shelving units, and after you wiggled the shelves, you saw that the door actually popped open.
Beyond the shelves was a double door leading to a hidden room. Off to the side was another 3-foot by 6-foot compartment. The cramped space contained a homemade wood cot, a crude shelf holding some toiletries, and a roll of toilet paper. A small hole had been cut into the wall near the ceiling, possibly for ventilation. A typed list of rules was affixed to one wall. They included, "I must always be ready to service my master and must never speak unless spoken to. I must always be obedient and never look my master in the eye." From outside, investigators could see into the small room through a two-way mirror. They also noticed that the hinges of the door had been damaged.
Top and at the bottom. You'll further notice the hinges are bent from obviously pressure from inside the door pushing out, trying to get the door open, both the top and bottom.
Remembering Lake's journal, investigators feared that Lake had acted upon his fantasy of kidnapping and holding captive a human slave. Forensic specialists dusted for fingerprints and latent evidence. They hoped that if Lake had indeed kept a prisoner here, he or she had left behind some clue of their presence. They found nothing. As the search of the property outside the bunker continued, an investigator noticed some loose soil next to the driveway. There, they found a 5-gallon plastic paint container. As darkness fell, the task force suspended its search. Inside the cabin, the investigators viewed one of the videotapes they had found buried in the plastic container. They could hardly believe what they were seeing. This case was becoming more frightening with each piece of evidence they uncovered. But nothing could prepare them for what lay ahead. After 2 days of searching Leonard Lake's cabin, investigators feared more than 8 people had been killed and possibly buried on the property. On the second night, the task force moved inside the cabin to view the videotape found buried in a plastic container. The tape depicted 2 women suffering extreme verbal and psychological abuse at the hands of Leonard Lake and his accomplice, who demanded sexual submission under the threat of violence.
We also observed an Asian male on the tape, and he had a knife in his hand, and he was cutting the clothing. This would be the blouse, the top, as well as the bra strap, removing clothes from the female.
The Asian male was identified as Charles Ng, the shoplifter Leonard Lake had identified just prior to his suicide. The Homicide Division of the San Francisco Police Department launched a full-scale manhunt for Charles Ng. Investigators started with a search of Ng's San Francisco apartment. They collected some video equipment and a number of videotapes. Everything was tagged as evidence and sent for analysis. San Francisco homicide detective Ed Erdelatz led a task force that investigated the year-old disappearance of the Dubs family. The equipment Lake and Ng had used to videotape their captives had once belonged to Harvey Dubs.
Investigators had obtained his California driver's license photo and had made up a photo collage, shown it to neighbors, and identified him as one of the people coming out of the Dubs home.
One of the Dubs' neighbors told investigators that the night before the family was reported missing, she saw two men leaving their residence. One of the men was carrying a large